So good evening, everybody. I'm Robert Keston, Executive Director of Stonewall National Museum and Archives and Library. And we are here today with Jenn Shapland, who wrote an extraordinary book. And it's doubly extraordinary because Jenn did a lot of work in archives, not only on this book, but previously and probably subsequently. So she has a good understanding of what Stonewall's purpose is in terms of making history come alive. We are doing many things here at Stonewall, including we've started the Circle of Pride, which is for organizations to work with us by sending us their logos and their contact information so that we are all prepared for Coming Out Day on October 11th. If it's always been important for people to come out because visibility is so important, it has never been more important than it is now, simply because the tides are in a very strange position right now. And although I'm not sure history actually repeats itself or just keeps going, we're at a time when silence does equal death. And as Audre Lorde said, your silence won't protect you. And that has been proven time and time again here in Florida, where we're located, in Texas, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Ohio, and in a vast number of states, whether you're someone who believes in women's rights, whether you believe in LGBTQ plus rights, this is the time to be loud and bold and certainly active before these upcoming elections. Policies matter, and who we elect to office based on those policies matter. Another thing that I would be remiss in not asking, and I'm sure it will end up in the chat, is please consider making a donation to Stonewall. We need your support in order to keep our archives and library up to date and to do the kinds of educational and informative programming that lets us know where we are today and why. If we don't know where we come from, we don't know where we're going. And that synergy between past and present is the only kind of action that we can take that will prepare us for a brighter future. And so at this point, I'm going to bring in our guest, Jenn Shapland, who is a brilliant writer. This book was a National Book Award finalist. It is about Carson McCullers, whose book, Member of the Wedding, among others, is one that stays with me from, I guess, middle school or high school when we had to read it. And as I think back on it, I think that we should also read it again as adults because we miss so much. Many of her books, or at least a few of her books, were turned into big Hollywood movies. So you can probably get them on one of the channels that streaming services out there. So there's just a tremendous opportunity here to be informed and educated by an exquisite writer. So welcome to Stonewall Public Programming. And I'm going to just start with your voyage in writing this book was one that I've not really seen authors take. And that was finding legitimacy, in a sense, for yourself through your discovery of Carson. And how did that even happen? I mean, how did she become this linchpin for you in coming to terms with yourself?
Thank you. That's a great question. And thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here and to talk with Stonewall Archives audience. That's such an interesting question. I mean, I guess it was really, as often occurs when you're in an archive or even in a library, the way that I came to Carson McCullers was a sort of happenstance, was kind of a matter of coming across some of her letters. And in reading those letters, I felt just a really strong connection. I felt something about my own experience in my own life, which involved being in a long-term closeted relationship. Something about that experience was acknowledged and validated in those letters. But it was something I hadn't seen represented or even really discussed anywhere else in my reading or watching or anything. You know, there was something about the way these two women discuss their relationship, Carson McCullers and a woman named Annemarie Schwarzenbach. And so it was finding those letters that was really like this kind of formative moment for me. And then the book details my sort of search for the story behind the letters, for trying to understand who are these two women, who was Carson McCullers, how do people understand her in her life now, and how did she understand herself? And I couldn't have told you this at the time, but I can now, in retrospect, having like written this book and talked about it, I can tell you that for me, it was really like that research project, which felt to me like I was trying to find something out about someone else, was a process of actually trying to understand myself.
Well, because I saw in your article in the Paris Review called "The Closeting of Carson McCullers," you wrote, and I quote, which I also saw in the book, it was her retroactive closeting by peers and biographers that I found most disturbing. I took it personally. I began to feel unreal, deranged. If none of these women were lesbians, do I exist? I mean, that's a really powerful statement to discover to some extent while you're doing research about something that you're writing about in your attempt to discover what's going on with them.
Right.
How, I mean, did you ever feel a complete, from this experience anyway, did you ever feel a complete and total resolution, or did the resolution, if there is a resolution, come after?
I don't know. I'm not sure about resolution, but that passage that you just brought up is, it's a moment where I've kind of, after finding those letters, I've started to read the biographies of Carson McCullers and, you know, tried to learn more about her. And the version of her life that's out there and that's represented in the biographies doesn't call her a lesbian, right? And doesn't really use any of that terminology. Or if it does, there are two different biographies. When those terms are used, they're almost as a way to disparage the idea of her being a lesbian or the idea of her being queer in favor of another version of her life. That's a very straight narrative involving Reeves McCullers, who was her husband. And so there's just this tendency by those who've written about her, and then by kind of the critical apparatus at large, to tell a very different story than the one that I so closely identified with. And so that's kind of the opposite of what I felt when I saw the letters, which is a sense of being invalidated, right, by another part of the archive, by a part that says, or by kind of an official record. And then, you know, to think that once I knew, and once I had more information about the relationships that Carson McCullers had in her lifetime, that her relationships with women in particular, and then understood that this was still the narrative of her life that predominated, realizing how many more people is that true about? Like, how many more famous American authors, and it turns out a lot, but how many more, you know, how many more people do we have this sort of simplified or kind of straightened narrative about, when actually, you know, their experience was much different. And that's because of, you know, all kinds of different things related to who's in control of their estate and who's in control of the scholarship about them, and all kinds of different people get involved. But with Carson McCullers in particular, during her lifetime, she was out. She was very kind of proud and open about who she was. And it was only after the fact that this different version of her life became the dominant narrative.
Which I guess, as you said, the victor writes the history, or the person who outlives the other writes the history, and therefore history can be so distorted
Yes.
by other people's agendas. And it seemed from the way you wrote that not only was she able to be out, but it just didn't seem to matter to her. She was just Carson, and this is what Carson does, and this is what Carson did, and the rest of the world didn't really have that dramatic an impact on her. She was successful. She was smart, clearly smart. She had a lot of amazing friends. She didn't have to hide. They accepted her for who she was, and yet their problems, certainly her doctor, who became her longtime lover, I guess, really did have a problem and fear. And even though she died only in Mary only died in 2013, she never seemed to evolve with the times or felt comfortable with the change in morality and culture that she experienced while she was partners with Carson.
Yeah, well, there's two things I want to pick up on from that. One is that I do think Carson McCullers faced a lot of pushback for her sexuality, but also just for her presentation of herself and for the fact that she was a writer in her hometown in Columbus, Georgia. People there, her friends and neighbors back home, really didn't understand who she was or what she was up to or why she was going to New York or why she was always smoking and typing and wearing pants. Like, this was all like beyond their, the community's kind of strict understandings of what womanhood was and what, how she should comport herself. So she definitely faced a lot of pushback there. And she also lived in New York and spent a lot of time in a very like open and welcoming queer circle. So she kind of lived in both worlds, which I think is a very common experience for a lot of people, even today. But as for Mary, Mary Mercer was her therapist for a short period of time, and then basically her partner for the last 10 years of her life when they were both living in Nyack, New York. And it's interesting to me because I don't really know what Mary thought about the morality of any of it. I don't know what she thought about the time she lived through or the time that she was with Carson. I have no idea really where she stood on any of that, but I do know that she wanted to make both her transcripts of her therapy sessions with Carson McCullers and all of their letters, the documents of their entire relationship. She wanted to make those things public when she died. And I think that's interesting. I think it says something about what she was comfortable with when she was alive versus when she was no longer on the scene and didn't have to answer any questions, but she did kind of want this history to be made available, which I just think is an interesting thing, like an interesting position that she took.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And you say it in the book that she seemed to want people to understand that there was love there, and to validate it, she had to let those things go, but she just didn't have the strength to do it while she was alive, even though she was not a youngster when she died. So right. Even in old age, she feared her reputation, where once she was dead, she sort of said, okay, whatever. I understand you wanted to read something.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So that would be great for people to get to hear.
Yeah, I was going to go ahead and just read a little bit from the beginning of the book. So in case anyone listening doesn't know very much about Carson McCullers, or also just to set the scene for kind of what the book sounds like, who I am, all of that. So I'll just read from the beginning. Question. Reeves asked Carson if she was a lesbian on the front porch of Carson's house on Stark Avenue after everyone had gone to bed. I picture them on a swing, though I know for a fact that no such swing exists. Carson answered with a swift denial, wished aloud that she wasn't one, then expressed plain uncertainty. I was the only patron in a small university archive in Columbus, Georgia, when I came across this exchange in a typed transcript dated March 1958. The transcript records Carson's fifth therapy session with Dr. Mary Mercer, whom she visited for help with writer's block. I read the question again. In her recollection, Carson told Reeves that she had loved a woman named Vera, another named Mary Tucker, but she wasn't sure what he referred to when he said lesbians. She asked him, as though lesbians might be a club that she could consider joining, or an unfamiliar species she might study. How do lesbians behave? Where do they live? How do they interact? Despite Carson's status as maybe lesbian, Reeves asked Carson when they would be married. She was 19. Articulation. Carson McCullers, when she is remembered as a novelist who grew up in Columbus, Georgia, moved to New York in her 20s, and spent the rest of her life writing about misfits in the American South. Her characters are mute or too tall or Black or queer, and almost always lonely and out of place in a conservative small town that looks a lot like her own. In 1940, her first novel, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, brought her fame at 23. Her books were made into films and Broadway plays. One of her best friends was Tennessee Williams. She called him Ten, and she feuded with copycat Truman Capote for years. She married the same man, Reeves McCullers, twice, and is rumored to have chased after women. She was often drunk, chronically ill, and like so many of her era, she died young. If you've heard of her, you've probably heard some version of this. To tell her own story, a writer must make herself a character. To tell another person's story, a writer must make that person some version of herself, must find a way to inhabit her. This book takes place in the fluid distance between the writer and her subject, in the fashioning of the self in all its permutations on the page. Correspondence. I wasn't expecting love letters. The paper was browned with age and wrinkled at the edges. Annemarie's handwriting filled the page, bearing hard to the right and often spilling back up the left-hand margin with last editions. I read through clear mylar sleeves, too intern nervous to remove the pages from their housings. April 10th at night. Carson, child, my beloved, you know that leaving the day after tomorrow, feeling half afraid and proud, leaving behind me all I care for once again and a wave of love. I looked up at the rows of manuscript boxes that surrounded me, mind humming, face flushed. Did that mean what I thought it meant? What did she mean, love? Instinctively, I listened for anyone who might be coming. Hearing only the ticking of the sliding electric shelves, I read on. To Carson, Annemarie recalled, talking as we did, you and I at that lunchtime, you remember, at the corner near the Bedford Hotel, with milk and bread and butter, ages ago. 4 years before I visited the Georgia archives housing Carson's transcribed therapy sessions. Before I knew much more of Carson than her name, I was an intern at the Harry Ransom Center, a giant collection of writers and artists' books and papers on the University of Texas campus in Austin. The gig was a kind of coup. It got me out of teaching for 2 years while I was a graduate student and gave me unfettered access to the papers and belongings of major writers. On each day of my 2 years at the center, I came into the shared intern office and answered queries from scholars about their research from a stack of mail by the door. Most were boring. About half of them were about either David Foster Wallace or Norman Mailer. My favorite find was a series of letters one of Mailer's mistresses had written him with the salutation, summing up my own feelings, "Dear American shithead." One day in early February 2012, a scholar wrote asking for letters between Annemarie Clarac-Schwarzenbach, whose name was utterly unfamiliar, and Carson McCullers, whose book titles had always struck a chord with me. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, like, same. But I'd never gotten around to reading any. Books seem to find me when I'm ready for them, or else I abandon them. I took the freight elevator down to the icy basement manuscript room, pulled the correspondence folder, it was 29.4, I still recall, and started reading it right there in the stacks.
Wonderful. Are you finished with her?
It's funny. The book actually was just translated into French, Spanish, and Polish, and those editions are coming out, I guess, later this month and next month. So if I thought I was done with her, I'm not. But it's interesting because I actually spoke with a Swiss journalist on Monday and learned that in the French-speaking world, Carson McCullers is really well known. Whereas in my experience, having done events for this book and talked to readers, not a lot of people have heard of her. Maybe they read something by her in school, but more increasingly, like, she's not someone who's taught a lot. So not many people are very familiar, but in the French speaking world, apparently everyone's familiar with Carson McCullers, this like young ingenue author from America. They're all very like well-versed in her work, which I think is so interesting. Not something I would have thought. So it's, yeah, so now I'm in this moment of kind of wondering how the book will translate, you know, how people will interpret the story, how they will understand Carson and everything else about it. So that's been an interesting moment for me.
And how they'll understand someone coming out of the American South being
right.
different. And it's so interesting because although she didn't like Truman Capote, he went to her funeral.
Right.
And her long-term relationship with Tennessee Williams, who wrote in some respects about the same kind of people that she did. You know, they're both of their Southern experiences and being outsiders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love looking at photos of them from the time period too, because they're both just so clearly trying to articulate through their style, through their clothes, through their self-presentation, kind of who they are. They're trying to be out. And that's one of the ways that sort of the photographic record was in contrast to, you know, the things I was reading. Because if you look at a picture of Carson McCullers, if you look at a picture of Tennessee Williams, you can tell that there's an identity they're really trying to perform, which I think is so, it's just interesting to see, but it's also just makes it really fun to kind of revisit and to see their friendship kind of develop through the decades.
One of the things that you did in the archives was go through clothing.
Mm-hmm.
You want to just talk about that just a little bit? What did you learn from that experience? Because I don't think that most people who think of archives think of them being places of collections of clothing, and why that clothing ultimately tells tales that much of the other information seems to miss.
Right. Well, the Ransom Centers, I don't know how unique they are, but they do have a lot of clothes. They have a lot of costumes from films, but then they also have clothes belonging to all sorts of writers and artists. So I cataloged Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's clothes, Gertrude Stein's and Alasby Toklas's, and Carson McCullers. And this was sort of after I'd found those letters and the part I read about. So I was cataloging this stuff. And first of all, it's interesting just to know what clothes make it to the archive and are kept. And it's not always clear why. So like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's socks are there, and we're not really sure why his socks are there, but we do know that his wife sewed his name into his socks. Like, that's an interesting fact that wouldn't be recorded elsewhere. And his house was in a fire, so you can smell smoke and you can see fire damage on some of the clothes, which is interesting. In the case of the Alasby Toklas collection, it's interesting because there's this kind of briefcase, there's all this stationery, there's a lot of like stationery and wallpaper stuff that says a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. All of it smells like their dogs, like it has a very like strong dog odor, and like their poodles were a big part of their lives. So like, but it makes sense, but it's just one of those very tactile, almost like scent memories that comes through on the object when you have sort of fabric involved. And then with Carson McCullers' clothes, I was so confused because there's a set of nightgowns in the archive. And for the longest time, I couldn't understand, like, why would someone donate cotton nightgowns? You know, this isn't, you know, what, this just doesn't seem like an appropriate thing to save and to donate and to use for posterity in some way. But I realized later that because, especially towards the end of her life, Carson was mostly bedridden. Whenever she had her photo taken, and there are a number of famous photos taken of her later in her life, she would be wearing one of those nightgowns, and then she would put some kind of jacket or vest or something, tunic, over it. And those vests and tunics and jackets were also in the archive. So it was almost as though someone, possibly her sister, had gone through and picked out all the outfits that she'd worn in famous photos and had sent those to the archive. But what I really loved about the clothes, I mean, it like gives you access to some of the decisions that she was making at the time about her own style. There's an item that still had the tags on it that she didn't wear, which didn't really look like her style. So you can kind of see maybe this wasn't really something that she wanted, or that was part of her look. But then you can also just really get a feel for the time period, for the way clothes were made, how much she wore something, how often, if it was worn down or if it was, brand new. And all of that sort of tactile encounter, I think, adds to our understanding of the person. But I'm interested to know if the Stonewall National Archive has any clothes, or is that something that you have in your collections? What kind of stuff do you have?
We have a robe that Harvey Fierstein wore.
Wow.
We have clothes from RuPaul. We have
gosh.
Ricky Martin's leather pants. We have warm-up suit from Martina Navratilova.
Oh, wow.
We have some costumes that were worn by different performers in different roles. We have boots from Rita Mae Brown, riding boots.
Wow.
So we have Ellen DeGeneres' sneakers. So we have a bunch of things. But after reading this, I'm certainly going to keep my eye open for more, because I think that the way you described it, it really gives an insight into people that you might not think of when you're looking at papers and when you're looking at letters and when you're looking at reports and the like, and yet there's probably nothing more intimate.
Exactly. I mean, and it's interesting because if an archive is just papers and just books, it's almost as though the person was just a mind or just a brain, only exists in language, whereas the person had a body, right? They had a whole life, day-to-day life. And that was like something that I also really enjoyed about doing those personal effects, was all the different objects that came up, and wondering, how did this fit into Carson McCullers' life? How did these like pen refills, just being able to see even the way objects were like labeled at the time, and the colors that were used on the packaging, things like that, just evokes a period, evokes a time, evokes design and style in a way that words on a page never quite can.
I mean, clearly she had a strained relationship with her husband, who also seemed to at least experiment, if not live a queer lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one. Mary and Annemarie and some of the others were foundational relationships, but who or what do you think contributed most to the way she was? I don't think that her husband contributed to the way she was. He was almost a detriment. And some of the others were not helpful either. They weren't positive reinforcement. Tennessee Williams seemed to be a good friend. Mary was an important person in her life, and certainly one that would appear was a positive role in her life, and certainly helped her through trouble or difficulties. But were there other people that didn't get as centrally focused on in the book that you think were main influences?
I think a huge influence that I talk about briefly in the book was the community of people at a place called February House in Brooklyn. And I didn't spend a ton of time on them, in part because it was a rabbit hole. And I, at that point in writing the book, was actually like, God, I could write a book about this whole, like this community, and then like the tangential community in Fire Island that kind of is also a part of it at the time, and like these different. Then I was like, wait, that's a different book. But yeah, that community, and there's also a wonderful book by Cheryl Tippins called February House that talks about everyone who lived there, which included Paul and Jane Bowles, Gypsy Rose Lee, who you mentioned, and a number of other, Christopher Isherwood, different W.H. Auden, poets and writers and musicians and dancers and choreographers who
And strippers.
who lived in the house. And it's really like that moment in Carson McCullers' like life trajectory is such a turning point for her, because she'd kind of been in New York living with Reeves, trying to sort of continue her writing career, and at the same time she was, their relationship was really strained and difficult. He was really jealous of her encounters with other people, and it's when she moves to February House without him that she's able to kind of have access to a queer community for the first time. She also has access to when she goes to the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and then later when she goes to Yaddo. So she kind of recreates this community throughout her life in different sort of artistic spaces. But that group at February House is like the first time she almost seems to be able to see another way that she could live, right? And that she doesn't have to be in this marriage. And that's actually around the time that she gets divorced the first time. She doesn't have to be in this marriage or locked in some kind of confining idea of what her family might be, but her family might be this ragtag group of people. And there's so many different kinds of queerness that were going on in February House, different kinds of relationships. And so I think that exposure was one of the things that was really transformative for her, and also like just broadened her vocabulary, broadened her community, her access, all of that. And I think her understanding of herself.
And what role did others play in her adapting her materials to other art forms?
Well, Tennessee Williams was really helpful to her when she was adapting Ballad of the Sad Cafe for the stage. And like it seems to me like she was actually almost using him as a writing partner at different points. They spent time together in Nantucket, and he was really like a sounding board for her. So I think they had like a very rich, almost like creative entanglement that sort of enriched both of their work, I think.
Were there any letters? There were some letters between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that gives an inside view, a closer inside view of the relationship that they had? Because that intimacy of sitting at different ends of a table and typing away has got to be one of the most intimate relationships you can have.
Mm-hmm.
Sharing your thoughts, sharing your feelings, taking something from the inside and pulling it out and putting it on paper. And in those days, it was a real typewriter with paper and not a computer, so you take it out and you read it. It just seems to me, was the relationship with Elizabeth Taylor or Marilyn Monroe partly through him, completely independent? Did that expand her horizons? Or was it just an intimate personal relationship between the two of them?
I know from the letters, like one of the things that they were both able to do in the letters to each other is share some of the like difficulty they were having, whether it was difficulty with writing, interpersonal difficulty with relationships, or difficulty with health. So Carson's very open with Chen about her health and about how she's feeling and how it's limiting her ability to do X, Y, and Z. And same with him. And there's even a certain point when he's planning to move out west and he asks her to move out with him. So there's this sense that they could almost save each other, right? Or like create a safe space from all of the difficulties in their lives together where they could be, which I think is really beautiful. Her relationship with Marilyn Monroe, my understanding is that I don't really know a ton about it other than that they had lunch with so Carson McCullers had Marilyn and Isak Dinesen for lunch, and that Isak Dinesen was only eating oysters at the time, so she served oysters. And I'm not sure about her relationship with Elizabeth Taylor, really. I don't know much about that. But it seems like almost like, in my understanding, the films that were being made weren't necessarily something that Carson was like super involved in. It was something that was happening a little bit apart from her. But the money from those films is kind of what enabled her to buy her house in Nyack, New York. So and to buy a place for her mother to live as well. So it was sort of, basically supporting her ability to go on writing, to keep writing her books.
When you look at those experiences, you moved also from one place to another. And did you see any correlation between her moving and your own move, going from one environment to another?
Do you mean my moving from Austin to Santa Fe? Is that what you're talking about?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. But yeah, I mean, Carson ends up in kind of a smaller town in an artistic community in Nyack. And I left Austin because it was so crowded. It was so busy when I finished grad school and I wanted to live somewhere smaller, and have ended up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a pretty small city. It's like 60 or 70,000 people. And yeah, for me, it was interesting because I moved here in part because I wanted to finish this book. And I wanted to live somewhere where it felt quiet enough that I could find that space, even mentally, but also somewhere where my partner, Chelsea, and I might be able to get jobs. And so we were looking for a place that did have a strong art community, because Chelsea's an art historian. And Santa Fe seemed like a place where we would feel welcome. And we have. It's been wonderful. But I've never really connected that with Carson's move. It's interesting.
But it was interesting to me that, especially when you said, Tennessee said, let's move, I'm going to move west for my health. And although Santa Fe is not necessarily west, it's that same kind of, you certainly think of Santa Fe as being west, whereas Austin, not as much, even though Texas is sort of west.
Well, and there's like a long history of queer people moving out west and kind of finding.
And Santa Fe is.
And especially Santa Fe. Yeah, definitely.
Artsy and creative.
Right.
And colorful.
Yes.
When people read your book and when people read her books, what would you hope that people would take away from that?
Well, I would love for more people to read her books. As a result, like if my book is something that people find interesting, like if that makes them go and read something that Carson McCullers wrote, I think that's a wonderful outcome. And her books do so much. I mean, I feel like they're some of the best evocations of like queer identity, of any kind of outsider identity. She's also talking in each of her novels so frankly about race and about race relations in the South, about white supremacy and what it is to live under that. She's talking about that in ways that I think are valuable to us now. And that I haven't read many books that deal with those issues in the same way that she does. I think there's something really valuable in the way she writes about race, the way she writes about gender, the way she writes about even ability. All of that is there in each of her books and is central, right? Is really like one of her subjects. So I think all of that's still really relevant, still really valuable, because she's always writing from a place of such deep empathy and such deep longing to understand even, some of her most difficult characters, like Amelia in Ballad of the Sad Cafe is the one that's coming to mind right now. But yeah, the other thing that I think I was hoping this book could do would be to open up space for other archival encounters, for people who go into archives, who find stories like this, to feel like they can write about them without it needing to be necessarily a scholarly book or a full biography. But there's so many interesting stories to be found in archives, and so many encounters that can shape you as a person, for finding the material. There's a really good book that came out of something that I just think is so interesting that the Huntington Library did. They had all of these different artists and writers and even musicians come in and look at the Octavia Butler archive, and she's a science fiction writer. And it's a very rich and complex and massive archive of all of her notes and her journals and her lists and things like that. And there's a book that came out of that called A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, that's just about one writer's encounter with that archive. It doesn't try to be a full biography. It doesn't try to do anything but show you what those materials reveal about the person. And I just think it's so amazing. And I love that the archive itself invited her in and was like, make something here, look at this collection that's amazing, and then create something out of it. So I just love the idea of more things like that happening, especially having worked in an archive as an intern and seeing behind the scenes and knowing what kind of riches are there and what kind of, yeah, strange intimacies you can find, and things that you wouldn't be able to know or understand otherwise about history.
And history informs just about everything else, because your book it derives from the history of what other people have collected and saved.
Right.
And your book is timely, not only in its reflection, but also by talking about what happened in the past. It's very current. It's just so very current. And your quest, your personal quest, and your quest to find out about these characters and about Carson, it was exciting. It was exciting to discover it with you. And that's sort of what it felt like, is, like I said to you earlier, that back and forth. You would cover a story and you would go away from it and you would come back to it and say, but now I see what they meant here. And I didn't see it before. And why did they leave that out? And it's so obvious from where I'm sitting that this is what it was. And yet they didn't want to say that.
Right. Right. I mean, I think that's one of the things that archives show you is just how fragmentary our understanding of history and of any person's biography really is. And I think, yeah, I think that's something that you miss sometimes. Like when you read a full biography, you get kind of this lovely narrative of a life. But what I was trying to do was show all of these gaps and all of these moments of confusion or uncertainty, discoveries I made, and then, things that I thought that ended up being errors, right? And then I found out the truth. So you're kind of constantly, yeah, it's going forward, going backwards, because you're kind of constantly finding something out, and then you find out something new that displaces that or that challenges it. Often you have to have two totally contradictory narratives that you just hold side by side, and we don't know which it is. And so I wanted to sort of be able to use the form of the book to show all of that strange movement that happens when we just start encountering these records and these sort of signals from the past.
And what was it like for you? And then we're going to ask a couple of questions, or at least a question that's in the Q&A. But what was it like for you to live in her house in Georgia?
It was so strange, because her house is a place now that's called the Carson McCullers Center for Writers and Musicians. And it's a residency. They invite writers and musicians to come and stay for month-long periods throughout the year. And so basically, the back of the house is an apartment where you stay, is a bedroom and a bathroom. And then upstairs and in the rest of the house is a museum devoted to Carson McCullers and her life. And the museum is often open for events and readings and different things that the university hosts there. But so when you're staying there, you're living in her childhood home, you're living in a museum, and then you're living amongst her furniture and different objects and photographs and things from all different moments through her life that have ended up in this house. And it's really unclear sort of which of these objects are, precious archival entities and which are just the furniture that you're allowed to sit on and use. And I just kept finding myself asking over and over, was this hers? Did this belong to her? Or is this something that just, happened to be in the house, and trying to piece together some version of her life just from the random assortment of objects that have ended up in that space.
And what's happened to her house in Nyack?
I don't have like a super recent update on it, but I know that they were in the process of trying to open it to the public. So the same group that owns the house in Columbus, which is the McCullers estate, but also Columbus State University. They also own the house in Nyack. And I think they are starting to open it up at least to like tours for students to take, things like that. But I'm not sure. And I actually haven't been to the Nyack house. I'd really like to go, but have never lined up for me to get there. But I think the goal is to create kind of a similar space that can be accessed by the public.
And that one, to some extent, if they've kept it authentic, would really be more her.
Right, because it was her house, and it was her house as an adult, whereas the house in Columbus was her childhood home. And it was eventually sold. Other people lived in it in the intervening years. So it wasn't kind of owned by her or lived in by her the entire time.
And has her stuff that she decided for it to be there.
Right, exactly. Yeah, which I think would be super interesting, something I would love to see. And I know that they've kept a lot of those objects, though I don't know to what extent they've kept them in place in the house.
And here's a question from Chris Wallach, or Wallach. I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong. I enjoyed reading that Carson replied to the Columbus Public Library's request for her papers, and that she would send them only if the library desegregated. Can you talk a bit more about that exchange? And did libraries in general play an important role in her life?
I would say certainly, because she was such an avid reader from a very young age. So libraries were super important to her. At the same time, I think, as I was kind of describing earlier, her relationship with Columbus, Georgia was pretty fraught, especially when she was an adult. So she spent a lot of time back in Columbus when she was in her 20s, and I think in her 30s as well. She spent a lot of time there because she was chronically ill. She had a series of strokes. So she would often kind of retreat from her busy life in New York, come back to Columbus where her mother was, and sort of just give herself a chance to recover and to convalesce. So she spent time there, but it was increasingly difficult because the people around her didn't really understand or accept the sort of person that she had become. And they were especially not very accepting of her writing and of her books. So when her second book, Reflections in a Golden Eye, came out, the KKK actually was making threatening phone calls to her house and saying, derogatory things about both the queer content of that book and about her writing about Black characters. And so that was sort of her relationship with her hometown. It was pretty difficult. And so I think my understanding is that when the Columbus Public Library reached out to her and said, now we want to celebrate you and now we want your papers, she probably already had kind of a knee-jerk reaction to that of hell no, you people, I think it was never a very comfortable relationship once she was a writer, because she just dealt with such scrutiny and such criticism from the people in her community. And then, she was also someone who stood very strongly by her convictions throughout her life. And so, because obviously she didn't believe in segregation, she couldn't, she couldn't handle having her papers go to an institution that was itself segregated. And it's very kind of common for her to make a stand like that about something, including about something as important as her own archive, her own papers. But I also think it's interesting because I went to the public library when I was there, and it's been sort of completely rebuilt, and so it's no longer really the building it was when she was alive, but they've renamed the street that goes to the library Carson Way. So there's still this desire to claim her, or this kind of retroactive kind of, certain parts of Columbus are still trying to claim her and others are trying to disown her at the same time. It's a very complicated relationship. I hope that answers your question.
So libraries were important, but her own personal library was a bone of contention.
Yes, that's what it seems like.
And did you ever get an indication that she ever, I mean, she died young, so she may not have spent a lot of time thinking about what she thought she would leave behind in terms of her legacy? Did she ever, in any of the things that you come across, consider what kind of legacy she would like to live, considering that she was in some ways ahead of her time with what she was writing and how she wrote?
I think that she thought of herself kind of in such a literary way. So I think for her, it was just important that her books existed. And she, if anything, like wished that she could have written more, right? Wished that she could have finished, like she so badly wanted to write an autobiography and never was able to finish that. And that was something she was sort of working on right up until her death. So I think that was something that drew me to this project and to her life, was this fact that she felt that there was a story about herself that she wanted to tell that she never got a chance to, that I was trying to sort of uncover what might that story be. But for her, it was really the books, and it was really the sort of literary legacy that mattered to her. And I'm sure, like, if we think about her persona and her personal life and her friendships, like she would probably love that people are still gossiping about her today and still talking about, all of the goings on at February House and in New York and in Fire Island, like all of those different circles that she was a part of. I'm sure she would be delighted by that, because she kind of loved to be the center of any kind of scene, or at least that's something that kind of comes through. But I don't think she would have imagined that would happen. I think she thought she would be remembered for her books. But in certain ways, it seems like she's remembered for other stuff as well.
And it would be remiss not to talk about alcoholism, which seemed to run in her family, and its impact, not knowing really how much it contributed to her early demise or her inability to finish some of the things that she was working on. You certainly made it clear that she drank a lot and that her mother was an alcoholic as well, but it never became clear, at least in the book, to what degree it limited her ability to do her work or to finish her work, or did it play a role in her inability to work?
It's so difficult to know. And I would imagine that it did, based on what I've read and based on what I know about people who live with alcoholism. Like, I would imagine that would make it really hard to finish a book. But at the same time, it's really difficult to tell, with all of the different kind of symptoms she was experiencing. She had this series of strokes. She just had a lot of pain that she was living with as well. And so it's very hard to discern, and I'm sure it was also hard to discern even at the time, what was causing what. Was it her drinking was causing her illness, or was her illness kind of contributing to her drinking, right? And then how did both of those things play into her ability to work? But in addition to those difficulties, she often had struggles with writer's block and with just not being able to write, or being kind of, frustrated and unable to write what she wanted, or write in the way that she wanted. So it seems like there was something psychological happening too. There was always a lot, and she's dealt with a lot of tragedy in her life. She dealt with Reeves' suicide. She dealt with her father's suicide. So she was kind of holding a lot at any given point. So I find it difficult, like, as someone who's not a medical professional or any kind of like psychologist, like I don't really know how to untangle the threads there. But yes, it's definitely clear that she drank, and it's definitely clear that she was ill and that she was struggling with mental health stuff as well.
And the people that she lived with, especially at February House, were probably big drinkers too. So
for sure. And so was Reeves. Reeves was definitely an alcoholic, and yeah, I think it was also, I think, in part the culture of the time period. Like it just seems like everyone was drinking so much, and that
Drinking
sort of
and
fed.
smoking.
Yes, and smoking. Right.
So here's another question from Gabrielle Scott. Once again, I hope I pronounced it right. Jen, I fell in love with the writing of Carson McCullers way back in high school and loved reading your book. While reading your book, I began reading Jack Parlett's book on the history of Fire Island. It intrigued me to see the overlapping themes in the two books. At the same time, a new documentary on the life of Patricia Highsmith has just come out. You mentioned the posthumous closeting of McCullers. What's your take on the current erasure of specifically lesbian and gay identities today?
It's a great question, and I'm very excited about that Patricia Highsmith documentary. I cannot wait to see that, and was also excited when her collected diaries came out a couple of years ago. Those are extremely juicy and interesting, and it makes you wish that more people kept diaries like that, because it's such an amazing insight into what it was like to live as a queer woman in that period. And one of the things that comes through very clearly is that, at least in sort of the younger years, the book is like this thick. I've only gotten through a little bit of it, but at least in her younger years, she and her other like queer female friends all had boyfriends or husbands, all of them, no matter what. And so like their queer lives were happening under the cover of these straight relationships, which I just think it's just interesting how commonplace that is. In terms of the current erasure of lesbian and gay identities today, I mean, that's a complicated question. And like the way that I would read it is to think about how rare it is to see one of these let's say one of these mid-century figures who we have all of these records that show that they had these queer relationships. It's so rare to see that depicted in a movie, a biopic, a TV show, anything like that. I actually just watched a movie about the Finnish writer Tove Jansson, who she was the cartoonist who did the Moomin cartoons, and she was also a writer, and she was queer. And there was a biopic made about her, and I was so excited to watch it because one of the salient facts of her biography is that for the last 30 years of her life, she and her partner Tuti lived together on this island off the coast of Finland in a house that they had built themselves. And I was like, well, that is something I have never seen depicted. Like two women living together for 30 years on an island, like that sounds fascinating. But the biopic never even got to their relationship. It spent the whole time on like the earliest part of her life when she was sort of dating men and dating women and uncertain of her identity. And it was unable to actually, like the movie wouldn't go there. Like the movie wouldn't actually show us her life. Like once she was sort of an out queer person, it would only show her sort of struggling and wrestling with becoming a queer person. And I thought that was so interesting in 2022, that like still that narrative that I'm craving, that I would love to see represented, just isn't out there, or isn't what makes it to the screen. So,
or at least doesn't make it to the mainstream screen.
Well, right, exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Unless it has a really big star.
Yes, right. And that's why, like, we get so excited about movies like Carol, when you are actually, able to see something like that with big stars. It's like, it's the most exciting thing.
Right. I mean, and it was such a well done film and such brilliant performances.
Yeah.
But I would imagine that many people were shocked by it.
Right, which is so odd. But it is like, yeah, mainstream culture is still like, even, despite all kinds of different shifts and changes, there's still a lot that hasn't been represented. And I would say lesbian identity in particular is something that we still have. I mean, we have the L word. We don't have a lot more than the L word in terms of mainstream.
Is that also in part because women were able to marry and live two lives where their husbands didn't seem to mind or notice, partly because they were just women at a time when that was the way it was. And they could live separate lives. They could live as what they wanted. Their husbands would go and have mistresses or what have you. And they were happy with that because then they were not encumbered either. Or that there was also a fluidity in sexual relations, that because it wasn't labeled, because you didn't have to give a name to it, that a wife could have her friends, could be in a marriage, whether it was happy or unhappy, it almost didn't matter, because she had a life of her own that no one really paid attention to. And once again, you mentioned her in the book, and we talked about it a little bit, an Eleanor Roosevelt, who had a house near her husband's house, but she didn't live with her husband, who had a long-term mistress. But at the end of Eleanor Roosevelt's life, she was madly in love with her doctor, who was a man, who rented an apartment above her own apartment, that he rented in her townhouse. And she was totally infatuated with him, which shows this flexibility, this fluidity in sexual orientation that we try to make rigid today by labeling everything and calling everything by, we need to know what it is. We need to have a name for it. We need to put it in a box, rather than saying, human beings are complicated creatures, and maybe we aren't that rigid. Maybe we aren't that finite. Maybe things can happen when we least expect it, with somebody who we would never expect it from.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's something strange. Like, obviously no one wants to go back. No one wants to, put everyone back in the closet, right? Like, that doesn't seem like a good solution to anything. But there's something about, and I'm interested in this kind of mid-century period in particular. There's some kind of freedom there, and there is some kind of fluidity and flexibility and openness that is harder to locate now. And part of it does have to do with labels and categories, which are so important, like are crucial to visibility. I mean, I use the word lesbian over and over in the book, in part because it's a word that, like, I don't totally understand. And I thought maybe if I use it enough, I will understand like how this label works and how to apply it. But I also say at one point that, like, maybe everyone's a lesbian, right? Like, maybe everyone's gay, like maybe everyone's on, like, maybe this is a much more capacious idea than it has sort of been made out to be. And I that feels accurate. That feels true to my own experience, and to, these experiences and these relationships I've read about among people in the past. But yeah, there is just something interesting about almost how the secrecy provides a space for the relationship to be anything, or to be completely outside of the view of sort of a shaping gaze of society, right? Like, the relationship could be anything because no one else can really see it. And I think that's something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it was so obvious in the book, and it's so obvious if you read history, that there are these relationships between people that are not defined.
Right.
And the unhappiness in a formal relationship is moderated to a large extent by allowing these other relationships within that relationship to exist. And that comes through the book. I mean, she marries the same man twice. It was never clear it was maybe clear that she didn't like him. It was not clear whether she ever loved him. And like and love are not mutually exclusive, certainly. And she had a very fulfilled personal life with other people. So that give and take, that ability to find yourself in the complexity and the fluidity of life, seemed to make her life more complete, even if it was not an easy life.
Right.
So how do you see, I mean, you said, just spoke about it a little bit, but how do you see that relating to where we're going from here, since we've gone from that, not that you're have a crystal ball, but that we've gone from what seemed to be hidden, and in some cases was hidden, but was not necessarily hidden so that people couldn't see it. They just didn't have words to speak about it, to a place where we have all the words, but maybe a lot more disruption in our lives, to a point where younger generations are calling it fluid or experimental or non-binary or all other kinds of things, which allow, once again, for a certain openness, an accordion-like series of relationships, rather than narrowing things down to, no, you either are this or you're this or you're this.
I mean, I think it's impossible to know. I do find it so interesting that Generation Z is really embracing the idea of non-binary gender. I'm interested to see kind of how that plays out in sexuality, and then how that plays out in different relationships, and also in the, I'm especially interested always in the cultural depictions of those relationships and sort of how that ends up translating to the wider culture. But I know enough about this country and enough about history to be very cautious in my optimism, because I mean, we are already facing such a strong backlash, I mean, as you know, in Florida. And I just think as much freedom as I see in sort of like new relationships to and understandings of gender and sexuality among younger people, I also see like this hammer waiting to kind of, you know, bring everyone back into place. So I don't know, I have kind of a dark perspective, I think. And there's actually one question here in the Q&A that's kind of about this. It says, could you talk about the relationship, if there is one, with the current book bans going on in the US and the erasure of queer identities and biographies and historical documents? And I mean, I'm not totally sure I know the relationship between those, but I do know in the case of my own book that those papers I was talking about, that Mary Mercer made available to the public after her death, so the transcripts of their therapy sessions and then all of the letters and correspondence between Mary and Carson, when I included quotations from those letters and from those transcripts in my book, the Carson McCullers estate responded and said I wasn't allowed to quote from any of it in print. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because of the queer nature of any of it, or because of what it revealed about anyone's sexuality or mental health or anything like that. I don't know why. But I do know that they basically issued a blanket, no, you cannot quote from any of this material. And I think that's something that happens more often than we are aware of. So often when you're reading someone's biography, or when you're trying to learn about someone, you're getting that point of view that someone behind the scenes has censored, right? Or has retracted something from. And so, you know, it's hard to know exactly why that's happening or where that's coming from, but it does seem, at least in the case of like the McCullers estate or other artists and writers estates, like there's a desire to control someone's legacy, to control the narrative of them that goes out into the world. But that control is often happening, is often being wielded by someone's relative. And as you know, LGBTQ people know, your relatives are not always the people who understand who you are, or who are most accepting of your identity. So I just think, yeah, there's definitely, there's just still a lot of power being wielded by people behind the scenes to sort of control what version we get of each of these narratives, which is why I think archives are so important, because if I hadn't gone to Columbus myself and looked at this material, I wouldn't have known it. You know, I wouldn't have known any of this. I had to actually see it, and then I had to paraphrase all the quotations in the book.
Well, on that note, speaking of archives, we invite you to come visit ours. We thank you for being with us. Here's the book. Get it. If you didn't, it's in the chat. And once again, please join Stonewall. Membership is not expensive. It really helps us survive. It helps us bring you programs like this and other kinds of programs. We have exhibitions in our museum part. We have tours of the archives, and we have an extensive library, probably the largest LGBTQ+ library in the United States and possibly in the world. Your contributions make that possible. Thank you very much, Jenn, for being with us. I love the book. I enjoyed the conversation tremendously. And I wish you extraordinary success in whatever you're doing next. And thank you, everybody else, for coming and joining us. And we'll see you next month.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thanks, everyone. And yeah, I totally agree. You should all support Stonewall National Archive. What a wonderful organization. Thank you. Thanks for having me.